Hello, my name is Cliff Goodwin, and I welcome you here today for Preaching the Gospel. The honor, the privilege is mine to be your host. Maybe you've tuned in, or maybe you've logged on at work during a break. If so, we are so thankful that you have taken or carved this time out of your day so that you can be with us for a period of Bible study. If you're interested, and perhaps some are, in maybe making a few brief notes as we proceed, the title for this study today would simply be Eyes Full of Adultery. Eyes Full of Adultery. And of course, I'm referring to these eyes, the ones with which we look and view and take in all of the visual stimuli that are around us in the world. Now, I know that is a peculiar title. I know that that's a statement that maybe is very attention grabbing, but many of you also know that it is a biblical statement. If you would, open your Bibles with me and let's begin right at the pertinent text. It's found in 2 Peter chapter 2. 2 Peter chapter 2. Now, in a moment, we'll get down to verse 14, but I actually want us to begin up about verse 12 to set a little more of the context dealing with 2 Peter. As the Apostle Peter penned this second general epistle, he is writing to warn of false teachers and to combat their evil influence among God's people. And when I call them false teachers, that is certainly an accurate designation. But also, as we study the case that is being dealt with in 2 Peter, we very quickly realize that more than simply being false teachers, that these people were also simply immoral, that they were wicked not only in their doctrine, but they were wicked also, apparently, in their manner of life. And we would do well to realize and to remember going forward that so often that proves to be the case, that so often what begins, we think merely as a digression in doctrine, before you know it, before too awful long, it is coupled with a digression in morality. And why not? You know, that really only stands to reason. Men and women who do not respect what the Word of God teaches regarding what may be considered matters of doctrine. Now, you really could point out that everything's a matter of doctrine, everything's a matter of teaching. But those who do not respect what the Bible says in those so-called, quote, doctrinal areas, then why? Why would they respect what the Bible says in areas of morality? And so as you study the case here in 2 Peter, that's the case that we find. You have false teachers who are teaching garbage with regard to their doctrine, but also they're living lives that could be described as garbage. They're living garbage, immoral lives. And so Peter now, he's writing to warn of such persons, and he gives us some very graphic descriptions of such persons. So now in 2 Peter 2 in verse 12, but these under consideration as natural brute beasts made to be taken and destroyed, speak evil of the things that they understand not, and shall utterly perish in their own corruption. Now, keep in mind, this is not rank Calvinism, as many people allege and which many people pursue, but these individuals, because of their own choices, they have reduced themselves, if you will, to this kind of description here in verse 12. And Peter warns, they shall utterly perish. Verse 13, and shall receive the reward of unrighteousness. You know, when we first hear about one's receiving a reward, our ears may perk up. You know, that's a good thing. We all would like to receive a reward. No, not in this case. They shall receive the reward of unrighteousness, as they that count it pleasure to riot in the daytime. In other words, there appears to be a shamelessness about these individuals, their wickedness and their wild living. It's in the daytime, as it were, nothing to hide, nothing about which to be ashamed, supposedly. Spots they are and blemishes, sporting themselves with their own deceivings while they feast with you. And so deception is involved here in the portrait as well. But now our statement, verse 14, having eyes full of adultery, and that cannot cease from sin, beguiling unstable souls, and heart they have exercised with covetous practices. The love of money creeps in as well. Cursed children, which have forsaken the right way, obviously. Now, if they have forsaken the right way, that does tell us that at one time, obviously, they had been in the right way. They have forsaken the right way and are gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Bosor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. Now, you want to talk about a deadly mixture, a deadly mix of wickedness and sin. As we work our way back through the verses we have just read, we've noticed now a couple of times covetousness, the wages of unrighteousness. And so you have the love of money. And no surprise, Paul would tell us in 1 Timothy 6 and verse 10 that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And so we see that in the mixture here. We've noticed the deception that comes up in verse 13. And no surprise, once more, the devil is behind all of this apostasy, and the devil is the father of lies. Deception is his craft, so to speak. And so we see the love of money, we see deception, we see lust. And that's really the point of our present study together here today. They have eyes full of adultery. And so suffice it to say at this juncture that these errorists, these false teachers, they were erring not only in their teaching, but they were erring in their living. Wicked persons. But now to draw this down to our present consideration, why is it said that they have eyes full of adultery? Well, we understand, I trust, what adultery is. Adultery is the sexual infringement or the sexual violation of the marriage covenant. And I draw that almost directly out of John 8, when the woman was brought before Jesus, as you may recall. She was brought before Jesus, and her accuser said, this woman was taken in what? Well, she was taken in adultery, and then they added in the very act. And so when we're speaking of literal adultery, we're not using adultery as a figure of speech, but when we're speaking of literal adultery, we're talking about the sexual infringement, the sexual violation of the marriage covenant. And so obviously this characteristic given here in 2 Peter 2 and verse 14 of these errorists is such that they do not respect marriage. They do not respect God's law concerning human sexuality. They don't respect any of that. They have very loose morals, if we could even call such morals, and they're described as having eyes full of adultery. Now, what's the connection between a person's eyes and his or her committing the sin of adultery? What's the connection there between? And I'm indebted to one of my former instructors from days gone by when I was in a school of preaching. I'm indebted to the man who used the description here, eyes full of adultery. And he described it like this. He said, these are people who look at every member of the opposite sex as a potential sex partner. And that really struck a chord with me. That made sense to me when I heard it now almost 30 years ago. And think about how many people in the world, we're talking about irreligious people generally. We're talking about people who are not spiritually minded. How often is it the case that we know a man who every attractive woman he encounters or he sees, he almost immediately begins looking at her in that way? Eyes full of adultery. Now, today, as we address this problem and this biblical topic, you know and I know that the Bible has a great deal to say about this. And I want us to begin in our elaboration or in our discussion of this more fully. I want us to begin, first of all, in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Basically, the format I'm pursuing now is, how can I, as a child of God, how can you in our viewing audience as children, men and women of God, how can we avoid this kind of lustful mentality? And make no mistake about it, it really is a mentality. It is a way of thinking that causes one to use his eyes in this manner, in such a way that he views every attractive person with whom he comes in contact, he views her as a potential sex partner. It's a mentality behind that. So how do we overcome that mentality? Well, first of all, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, we need to realize that our bodies, God did not just make us and give us our bodies for the purpose of sex. You know, it's amazing, but a lot of people in the world, they practically live their lives that way, if we're honest. It's as if they feel like they have been given this body, the physical body they possess, for really no higher purpose than just to have sex with as many people as they can. Friends, that's not the case. That's not the case at all. Look with me in 1 Corinthians 6, beginning at verse 13. Paul is anticipating one of their arguments, meats for the belly and the belly for meats. You say, well, Cliff, that argument doesn't make any sense to me. Well, it's the argument of nature, of natural purpose, supposedly. In other words, foods were made for human consumption, and the human belly was made to digest meats and foods, and so it's just natural. And so the argument is that sexual relations are really just as natural as eating food. And so why not indulge? But notice how Paul responds. He says, but God shall destroy both it and them. Well, that gets your attention. This is Paul's way of saying, look, don't use that flimsy argument. This is not true. This is not accurate. And then he goes on and he states such. Now, the body is not for fornication. I have that portion underlined here in my personal Bible. Now, the body is not for fornication. And so step number one in avoiding this mentality and thereby not having eyes full of adultery, step number one would well be realizing that my body was not created for fornication. But rather, Paul says, my body was created for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. Now, let me pause briefly here to point this out. It is true, as the Holy Spirit inspired Paul to write, obviously it is true that the body was not just created for sex, and certainly not created for fornication, sinful sexual union. It's not created for that. But at the same time, let's just add this caveat or this other consideration. It is true that God created gender. We know all the way back to Genesis chapters 1 and 2 that God created them male and female. Those are the two, yea, the only two God ordained and God created genders. And so, in one sense, it would be equally accurate from a biblical perspective if someone said, well, God created man as a sexual creature. That is true. He did. He created man as a sexual being, whether male or female. But God, in his design now, and this is where the world stops, but in God's design of creating humanity as sexual creatures, he also ordained that such sexual expression and fulfillment be reserved solely to the relationship of marriage. And that's Hebrews 13 and verse 4, as clearly as can be seen, where the Hebrews author penned, marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled. That is, the marriage bed, really the word from which we derive our medical term for sex, coitus. The marriage bed, the sexual relationship in marriage is undefiled, but then he says, adulterers and whoremongers or fornicators, God will judge. That is, they stand under the condemnation of God. And so Hebrews 13:4 forever settles the question of when or where is sexual expression and sexual fulfillment, where and when is that pleasing to God? And the answer is within the bounds of holy matrimony, okay? Biblical marriage, one man, one woman for life. And so we add that as a consideration. But all that being said, our bodies have a much larger purpose, a much larger scope of purpose than just sex. Our bodies are created for the Lord. Back to 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 12, and the Lord for the body. So much so that you could move down to the end of this chapter now, 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 20. For ye are bought with a price. As Christians, we have all been bought, redeemed with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. So, helpful hint, if we'll call it that. Number one, how can I avoid this mentality that would result in my having eyes full of adultery? And the answer is appreciate the God-given purpose for your life and your body. He didn't give you life. He didn't give you a body just to have sex with as many people as you can. That's wickedness. That's unscriptural. That's not the case. Your body is for the Lord. Your body is given with the intent and with the purpose that you live your life in service to God. In all manners, in all aspects of life, glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which as a Christian, these belong to God. Okay? Helpful hint or point number two. And that is now realizing the purpose of our bodies. Number two, we also have to be purposeful or deliberate in our efforts to avoid lust. Okay? Let's go to the words of our Lord from the Sermon on the Mount. Turn with me in your Bible at home to Matthew chapter 5, the initial chapter of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's account. And we'll begin reading at verse 27. Jesus says, Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not commit adultery. Well, in fact, that's right out of the Ten Commandments. But notice Jesus has more to say. But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. Now, he's not committed fornication. Fornication would be, of course, the overt act and the sexually joining together of two parties, but he has committed adultery with her in his heart. Why? Because he's looked after this woman to whom he has no God given right, and he has lusted, he has sexually desired her. Hmm. Well, this is such a problem, in fact, that in the next few verses, Jesus talks about if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee, for it is possible for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. Now, obviously, Jesus here is using very extreme language. He's speaking, I believe, probably in what could be termed hyperbole, but don't miss the point of this extreme language. The point is that inward lustful sin is a problem. It's not a mild matter. It's not something to be taken lightly, but the obvious import is it can cost you your soul. Lusting after a person to whom you have no God-given right, maritally speaking, that can cost you your soul. And so Jesus, in the extreme language that he then employs in verses 29 and 30, the point he's getting across is you do what you have to do. Do what it takes to avoid committing this sin. See? And after all, think about it. If a man does not follow the advice of Jesus, and more than the advice, if he does not follow the teachings and the commands of Jesus here in this text, then what's to safeguard him? What's to prevent him from ultimately one day getting to the point where he could be described as having eyes full of adultery? There's nothing that I can identify. There's nothing that would help to ensure that he doesn't get to that point if he rejects the clear teachings of Jesus. And so our second consideration here is we've got to be purposeful and deliberate in how we go about avoiding this. Now, I love the example here. I love the example of the patriarch Job. And so go back with me to likely, probably what is the oldest book, the oldest text in our Bibles, that is the book of Job. And notice how Job described this in the beginning of Job 31. Look with me to Job chapter 31, beginning at verse 1. The old patriarch said, I made a covenant with mine eyes. A covenant. It's almost as if he's saying, I entered into a contract with mine own eyes. Well, Job, what in the world are you talking about? Why then should I think upon a maid? Oh, well, see, the term maid is introducing a member of the opposite sex, a female. Job says, I have made a covenant with mine own eyes. And the point being, I have agreed with mine own eyes that I'm not going to think upon a maid, upon another woman. Now, what do the eyes have to do with the thought process? Well, in this regard, a great deal. A great deal. You and I understand that not only is the eye the window to the soul, as if when we're looking into someone's eyes, it's the window to the soul, but you also understand that the eye is one of the greatest sources of sensory intake. You know, how do we intake sensory information from the environment around us? How do we do that? Well, we hear, the ears can be used from that. We feel our skin. We can feel anything from touch to temperature. So that's true. But one of the largest sources of sensory intake from our environment is our eyes. And so basically here, what Job is saying is it's not hard to get it all, I don't believe. He's saying, look, I have made a covenant with my eyes. I have made a deliberate decision, a purposeful decision that I'm not going to allow my eye to wander and to fixate on these other women, perhaps with whom I come in contact. I'm not going to behold them. I'm not going to look upon them so as to begin to get the wheels turning in my mind, so as to begin to start thinking about them lustfully. Why then, he asked, why should I think upon a maid? Well, that's a great point. And not only is it a great point, but as you and I need to realize, it's a great example. And so if we were to apply Job's mentality in a very practical way, first of all, men, these cell phones that virtually all of us possess and we keep, we need to make a covenant with our eyes that in playing, as it were, on our phones, that we're not watching and viewing and observing things that puts our minds in an evil place. It certainly applies there. It applies with the television sets in our homes. It applies with the computer monitors, whether laptops or whether personal computers. It applies in what we read and the literature that we take and we purchase and we peruse. The Bible teaches the example of Job was he made a covenant with his eyes. He was purposeful. He was deliberate, not to mention careful in where his eyes went. And that certainly needs to be the example that you and I follow today. Now, as we prepare to wrap this up, we've talked about having eyes full of adultery, and I believe this is a very timely lesson because you well know, as do I, that we live in a sex saturated society. That's just the lamentable truth. That's where we find ourselves today. How is it that we, as children of God, can keep ourselves and our thoughts and our hearts, how can we keep them pure? And of course, we've touched on a couple of things. We need to have a biblical mentality regarding our bodies. We need to be purposeful and deliberate in our eyes, the use of our eyes, and the care that we give to our eyes and what they behold. But long story short, also, we need to set our affection on things above. Colossians 3, verses 1 and 2. May God help all of us to do just that and to avoid this problematic sin. Thank you.